Sharing Vietnam today would like to showcase a reporter, despite of his young age, but has lived in Vietnam for nearly 10 years and collaborated with several well-known newspapers of Vietnam, such as NHIN News with the online English version, VIET magazine, The Saigon Times. He has a lot of interesting insight about Vietnamese people in comparison with the people of the United States in California, where he was born and raised. If we seek his information on Google, we can see a lot of articles, reports on culture, current situation, tourism, and culinary of Vietnam in many different newspapers. This suggests that there is a deep understanding of Vietnam, as well as a significant interest for this S-shaped country in the heart of this journalist. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sharing Vietnam on VTC10 NetViet. Today we welcome a freelance journalist and has spent a long time living in our country, Mr. JON DILLINGHAM, and he will share with us the stories, his view about the culture, the life, and the people of Vietnam. Thank you for joining Sharing Vietnam today. So first of all, we know that you have lived in Vietnam since 2006. So can you share with us your stories, your life as a journalist in our country?
I worked for a variety of English publications in Vietnam. I worked as an editor at Saigon Times, Saigon Phom, Vietnam News, and I did some stories for them. I wrote some stories for them as well about being a foreigner in Vietnam for the first time, some cultural stories, stories about food, bars and restaurants, Vietnamese language, stories like that, basically about a foreigner seeing Vietnamese culture and stuff. I did some travel stories about traveling around Vietnam. And eventually in late 2006 or 2007, I started working at NHIN. And we had just a small English website at that time. And I was working as an editor there and also writing in my free time. And we opened a daily newspaper, the NHIN Daily, and expanded the staff, and we had a big newsroom for 1 or 2 years. And at that time I was writing a little bit more serious stories. I wrote about Vietnamese history, the relationship between the United States and Vietnam. I wrote a lot about Agent Orange and was with NHIN for many years, and we went from the daily newspaper to a weekly newspaper. And we went through a lot of changes and had a lot of really interesting experiences with NHIN in Ho Chi Minh City.
So before coming to Vietnam, do you work anywhere else or have an experience as a journalist in America back in your home country?
I hadn't really worked a whole lot before I came to Vietnam. Some odd jobs and stuff in high school and college, and then when I graduated college, that's when I came to Vietnam, and I spent about 3 months in Vietnam. And at the end of that trip is when I met a good friend of mine, still one of my best friends in Vietnam and in the world. And he introduced me. He was working at NHIN at that time, which was just the English edition was just a small. There was 6 people in the office just doing a small website. And he was the one who introduced me to that kind of work. Saigon Inside Out. That was the first. Those were the first guys to publish some of my story. Enabled me to learn a whole lot about a new culture and learn a whole lot about myself.
What are the topics that you're most interested in writing and showcase about Vietnam?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the very beginning, I was, all I knew about Vietnam was from, American war movies and things like that. And I had studied the war in college. And so that was the first thing that interested me. And when I traveled here as a backpacker, I saw a lot of that, a lot of the war sites and things like that. But once you're living here, and even when I was traveling, it was really meeting the people and hearing their stories that was the most interesting thing. Not, the history books that have been written in America or anything like that. It's difficult to compare sort of American culture and Vietnamese culture. It's difficult to compare any cultures, and cultures are kind of fluid and amorphous, and it's kind of a nebulous word. There's so many different cultures within both America and Vietnam, but certainly, you know, living here as a foreigner and being used to a way of life in America, and then coming here and having a new way of life put in front of me, and having to try and understand it and live in it was a huge mind-opening experience. So yeah, I think you know, a lot of the things that a lot of foreigners say. I mean, the family life here is really strong and really different. The family culture, and that was something that affected me early on. Seeing the way Vietnamese people live with their families and support their families, that was a huge thing. And
So can you share with us one of the stories that had been a great memories for you while traveling and writing about our country?
You know, the first that comes into my head in this Visions of Vietnam series, it starts with a trip that I took to Ha Giang. And when we drove from Hanoi to Ha Giang, we stopped in to In Quang province. We stopped in a village just to stop in a village for no reason. We saw that it looked really nice, and there was a pagoda up on the mountain, and so we went up to the mountain to visit the pagoda and get a view. And it was closed, but a guy showed up. He was maybe 40, and he had tattoos all over his body, and he was really a energetic guy, very excited. And yeah, he told us stories about his former life as a criminal. After 10 or 20 years as a criminal and being in jail, he had found this same pagoda that we found on this road, and he became friends with the nun who runs the pagoda. It's a tiny little place. You know, that kind of saved his life, he said. He just now stays at this pagoda. Now he's got a wife and kids, and he says he's very happy. It's an interesting thing. We found this pagoda when we needed some beautiful place to sit, and he also found this same pagoda when he needed some beautiful place to.
The people and the life of Vietnam are the inspirations for John. His articles often receive sympathy of overseas readers. Since then, he is an important factor in creating a brand for NHIN News, the online journal that he had worked with in the past 7 years. His interest in the cultures of Vietnamese people inspired him to experience and travel to many areas, different locations in Vietnam. He is the author of the chained reportage on NHIN News called Visions of Vietnam, where he tells stories that he has experienced in the provinces such as Hanoi, Tuyên Quang, Bình Thuận, the places where perhaps even for many Vietnamese would be unlikely to have the opportunity to set foot on. This is another story of foreigners that have lived and have felt in love with Vietnam. Though they may come from different cultures and background, but they share the same interest in the life, the admiration for the perseverance of the Vietnamese people, and above all, they always feel at peace while living here. I think that Vietnam and America is very different from each other. So can you share with us the things that had the story that had you impressed and very intriguingly different about our country?
You know, in general, I found in a lot of places there's a kind of simplicity to things. There's a kind of nonchalance to life that really attracts me. You know, in some of the older generation, there's this word ambition, and it's not necessarily a good word. It's almost a bad word. And you know, growing up in America, you're taught you have to be ambitious, and you have to climb all these ladders, and you've got to be the biggest, best. You got to do big things. You got to have big dreams. You've got to be. Everything has to be huge, and you really have to try hard, and you really have to be the best there is all the time. And here, it's just a little bit different. You can just kind of find your place and live simply, and people don't begrudge you for that. again, things have been very difficult here for so long, but there is a kind of peace I find here that I don't find a lot in America.
So you have wrote many columns about news and about the life of Vietnam, traveled, food and entertainment in Vietnam. What are the things that that you wrote that had the best react from the audience?
I've done two big series, I guess, in my time in Vietnam. And one was in 2008, I did a series on Agent Orange, and that was about 10 stories. And that got a lot of great reactions from all over the world. There's a lot of activists working with causes like this, and some of those stories were translated into Vietnamese and put in Vietnamese newspapers, and both young and old Vietnamese readers got in touch with me, and that got a really good reaction. And then the new stories that I've been doing now, this Visions of Vietnam series, which is just about me traveling through Vietnam on my motorbike, that has gotten some bad reactions, but it's gotten a lot of good reactions, which are very simple, non-ambitious stories. There's not a whole lot of action or climaxes in those stories. They're just about a guy driving around on his motorbike and meeting, people, hopefully, that are interesting with interesting stories. And people seem to really like that.
For newspaper in Vietnam, can you suggest the things that the foreign and the expats would be interested in reading about our country?
Well, I think just the people. I don't think there's any one kind of person or any one kind of story, but I think anywhere you go in the world, it's going to be the people that are the interesting thing. I mean, I think you can write stories about Vietnam's natural beauty and people will be interested. You can write stories about traveling and going to the big tourism sites and people will be interested. You can write about the food and people really love to write. Foreigners really love to read about food these days. That's a huge trend. And people love that stuff. But I think what would really interest people is write about the food and write about the landscapes and the beauty and the tourism sites. But if you find the people that are involved in making the food or that live in those beautiful mountains and talk to them and tell their stories, whatever the story can be, anything. It can be a story about their family. It doesn't have to be a big story about the war or a big. It doesn't have to be dramatic, but just everyone in Vietnam, everyone all over the world has little stories to tell, and those are the most interesting. And I think, again, those are the stories that get the best reactions, when you've got people and you let them tell their story. That's what I would encourage people to write about.
What are your plans in Vietnam in the near future?
I want to just continue writing this Visions of Vietnam series, one story per week. Past year I've been driving all over the country, from the Mekong Delta up to the Chinese border, and there's a lot of stories in there, and I would like to try and just keep telling them every week, hopefully a different place, and my life in Hanoi and the different transformations that I've been going through. And
thank you, John, for joining Sharing Vietnam today, and I hope that you will continue on to have such a great experience, a great life in our country.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
And that's the end of Sharing Vietnam today. Thank you so much for watching us. Any questions and recommendations, please email at sharingvietnam@vtc.vn. Thank you and see you again.